If you asked a sample of people to describe the game Arc Raiders, you'd get a variety of answers. Some people would say it's all about robots, others would say it's all about robbing people and stealing their precious toasters, and others still would say that it's actually a very detailed simulation about raising the perfect chicken. Don't get me wrong, these are some pretty good suggestions, but I don't think any of them really get to the heart of what Arc Raiders is all about. If you ask me, Arc Raiders is about one thing, and one thing alone. And that is inconvenience. See, everything in Arc Raiders, every single mechanic, every single enemy, every single system, has been deliberately and meticulously designed to be more annoying and more time-consuming than it feels like it should be. Take looting for example. Unlike in most games where getting treasure is as simple as walking up to a chest and hoovering up all the goodies, in Arc Raiders you need to find the loot container, which is harder than it sounds, then spend several loud seconds busting it open, and then you have to wait for each bit of loot to individually reveal itself just to see if the box contains something useful and not another handful of rusted tools and seeds, all while obscuring your view so you can't see what's sneaking up behind you. Enemies too are also incredibly inconvenient. Almost every bad guy in the game is faster and more damaging than you, with even teeny tiny wasps representing a potentially lethal threat that means you'll spend huge amounts of time hiding from them, and even more time hiding from other players waiting to shoot you in the back right when you thought you were safe. And the less said about leaving levels, the better. You can't just quit whenever you want and keep your treasure nice and safe, you need to make your way to an elevator, which are almost always way out in the open and patrolled by powerful enemies. And even then, you can't actually get in until you activate it, which starts a massive siren and a bunch of flashy lights as you wait for it to arrive, signalling to everyone for miles around exactly where you are and that you've probably got a backpack full of precious toasters ripe for the taking. Yeah. Arc Raiders is a game built around inconvenience, or, to use the technical term, it's built around friction as a cornerstone of its design. The game is committed to making every decision and every interaction just a little bit more complex and difficult than it feels like it should be. And far from being something that ruins the game or makes it less enjoyable, I actually think that Arc Raiders' fixation on friction is, and bear with me here, the secret ingredient that makes the whole thing work. Now, I know what you're thinking, how can that be? I've just listed a bunch of things that the game does that are, by anyone's measure, not very much fun. How can not being allowed to fight enemies properly, being forced to waste time doing things that other games make instantaneous, and being punished for making the tiniest mistake with having your cool guns taken away, make a game better instead of worse? Surely Arc Raiders, and in fact all games, would be much better and more fun if they removed as much friction as possible and made gameplay nice and smooth. Right? Well, as intuitive as that might sound, game design is unfortunately a bit more complicated than that. While the many different forms of design friction might seem to be solely negative inclusions, I mean, whoever said that their favourite Breath of the Wild mechanic was the weapon degradation? Fucking no one, that's who. When seen as part of a greater whole, all the points of friction within Arc Raiders, as well as the many irritating, time-consuming or inconvenient parts of other games as well, actually serve to enrich the final product far more than we think. And if these elements of friction were removed, then many of our favourite titles wouldn't just be worse, they wouldn't work at all. To give an example of just how large of an effect design friction can have on a game, we need only look at the development history of Arc Raiders itself. Way back in the day, in the far-flung year of 2021, Jeff Keighley, creepily enthusiastic proxy for the shadowy puppet master that is the mainstream games industry, introduced Arc Raiders not as the cutthroat, tense extraction game that we know today, but as a strictly co-op PvE title, one that prioritised powerful player characters, expressive movement, and easy breezy gameplay systems that are completely at odds with the friction-filled game that actually got released. So, what changed? Well, simply put, as impressive as the early versions of the game were, according to the developers themselves, it wasn't very much fun, and so they delayed Arc Raiders in order to completely retool it and find some way to make their ideas work, eventually giving us the friction-filled game we have today. And here's where it gets interesting. See, modern day Arc Raiders still looks pretty damn similar to the original version that was shown back in the Game Awards. It's got basically the same enemies, a lot of the same weapons, and pretty much exactly the same maps. The only thing that really changed in those 4 years of dev time was infusing that same foundation with a bunch more friction. The developers made player characters slower and more fragile, they made the Arc robots stronger, they obscured information on how much damage you were doing that was previously readily available, they took away the reliability of co-op and replaced it with dog-eat-dog PvP, and, most fundamentally of all, they reoriented the gameplay loop to focus not on bombastic action fighting a big robot boss as a team, but tense stealthing around and gathering up trash, with victory being defined as just getting out alive without losing all your progress, plus whatever guns you arrive with. And yet, just by adding things that made Arc Raiders slower, more punishing, and more inconvenient, they turned an experience that even the people who made it thought wasn't fun into a wildly successful title, and one of my favourite games of the year. A game that's so good, I'm even willing to overlook its genuinely awful voice acting. This is what I mean when I say that friction in game design is such an interesting and important topic. By changing its relationship to friction, and, you know, also doing some other stuff that's not the topic of this video, Arc Raiders turned its fortunes around, and this element of game design is just as crucial to the appeal of other great titles too. Everything from the most satisfying of action games to the most cerebral of strategy titles owe their success, on some level, to adding restrictions and obstacles that exist solely to annoy and disempower us. And from the outside, it's difficult to see how this happens or why it works. So, how does it? What is the design secret behind friction, and why should we celebrate it, in spite of the fact that interacting with it usually sucks? And why couldn't Embark just release the frictionless PvE original version of Arc Raiders? Why didn't it work at all? Well, I'm glad you asked. The thing that makes this whole idea make sense, to me at least, is that just like in physics, friction is what happens when two moving parts are in contact, and the more friction there is, the more those two parts of the game are forced to interact. And, while that might be a bad thing when you're designing a car, in game design, mechanics and systems that serve only to increase friction function as a very important way of bringing us into closer contact and interaction with other parts of the game, and making it feel like one cohesive whole rather than a bunch of separate bits that don't really interact. That sounds less insightful than it did at 4 in the morning, but it's staying in the script anyway. You're not my boss. Actually, shit, you kind of are. You're not my dad. Anyway, one of the main ways that friction can serve to improve our experience of games can be in amplifying what's already there. By forcing us to spend slightly more time and effort on each individual choice by adding friction points to otherwise rote actions, games can sneakily get us much more invested in what's going on and get us to think and care about actions we'd otherwise glide right past. Survival horror games have always been the masters of this. These games are loaded with design friction that all serves to amplify the tension and make their monsters scarier. The fact that their camera angles are wonky in a way that makes it hard to see exactly what's going on, that they make movement clunky and slow, and enemies both hard to kill and difficult to avoid, makes combat and the pressure of managing your supplies much more threatening. Because not only do you have much less control over the outcome, you also need to fight this friction as well as the bad guys. This added difficulty and obscuring of information is, when you get right down to it, entirely arbitrary, but without it, you'd feel more in control and safer, which is anathema to the kind of experience that survival horror games are trying to create. And the same is true for other games and other genres that also rely heavily on friction to get you to care about what's going on. For example, Pacific Drive's spooky haunted car controls terribly and is constantly falling apart, meaning you need to be very careful navigating around obstacles and always performing little patch jobs to keep it running. It's very annoying, but in a way that lends some much more authentic tension to the race against time, and some extra satisfaction to successfully escorting your bucket of bolts to the end that you'd never feel the same level of personal attachment to if your car were a souped-up rocket-powered off-road Ferrari that always worked. And part of what makes Monster Hunter's hunts so franchise-definingly rewarding is all the work you've got to put in to actually fight the monster. Without the tracking and the preparation that you've got to do before you start each hunt, not to mention the constant interruptions during it, the eventual kill wouldn't be anywhere near as climactic. In fact, the arena fights in the Monster Hunter series prove this very well. They are stripped down and streamlined versions of the hunts with none of the usual friction, and as a result, they're much less fun, despite being essentially the same fights. Another way that friction can trick our brains into getting more invested in stuff is by restricting our choices. We psychologically always want to keep our options open, so when we're forced to choose between two options, or when we're forced to make a choice under pressure, we compensate for this discomfort and annoyance by doubling down on the thing we eventually choose. This is the kind of psychology that Telltale games, and the more recent Superior Dispatch, use to get you to give a shit about the story, even though that you know deep down, it's probably not going to have a major effect on the way the plot develops. For example, the very fact that you can't be pals with both Waterboy and Phenomenon Travis Willingham instantly endears you to the one you choose, and when the game puts you under time pressure, you're forced to think on gut instinct, connecting you more viscerally to your choices in the story. This is the exact same big picture choice friction that made people instantly attach to Mudkip over those two other dumb choices for idiots, and it's the engine that drives the similar trend of take 3, pick 1 design in roguelikes. It's substantially more effective at building a sense of investment and engagement than just giving the player items at random, like in more traditional roguelikes, because you aren't just deciding whether an item is valuable in the abstract, you're also having to give up the other options in order to get it, meaning it feels like the decision cost more effort to make, even if it really didn't. Of course, this stuff doesn't just affect gameplay in the long term. Implementing friction at a tactile scale that modifies our immediate actions by doing stuff that makes basic movement and interaction less responsive and more of a commitment is key to adding a sense of weight and emphasis to our play. The secret sauce of all FromSoft games, and also every game that successfully copied them, is that the stamina system combined with every animation having ridiculous wind-ups and recoveries means that every move must be deliberate, and preparing to swing something like a two-handed heavy weapon is a lifelong relationship that you have no choice but to commit to. Conversely, in games where attacking and moving is less consequential and easier to either cancel out of or manipulate, giving your actions a feeling of impact and viscerality is much harder, because no matter how many flashy effects you put on screen, what gives something a feeling of mechanical heft is its power over us, not our power over it. This is also something that's true for shooters. Get into a gunfight in any number of ultra-smooth and tactile mass-market FPS games, and most of the weapons, in spite of their obvious lethality, are going to feel like pea shooters. By contrast, the clunkier and more punishing a weapon feels to use, the more satisfying it will be to nail a hit. The likes of the AWP in Counter-Strike, the temperamental old-school weapons of Hunt Showdown, or any of the crappy junk weapons in the Metro series, all feel great to fight with, because actually getting them to play nice and do what you want is loads of work, and therefore really rewarding. Special mention goes to the Pharaoh in Arc Raiders, by the way. It's a single shot, incredibly slow and really hard to aim, essentially musket that kicks wildly when you fire and is, as a result, by far the most satisfying gun in the game, in spite of the fact that it's pretty bad. There is nothing in the game that feels better than nailing a faraway snitch with this thing, and that's precisely because it's fighting you every step of the way. However, friction exaggerating and intensifying our decisions is only the beginning. Through smart systems design, developers can even use friction to create entirely new decisions and deeper ways to express our skill and knowledge. A great example of this is the spooky Irish mystery game, The Seance of Blake Manor. Rather than the usual detective game setup where you've got infinite time to solve the case and are compelled to click on and investigate everything, in this, every item you inspect and every topic you discuss moves the in-game clock forwards, and you only have just under 2 days to crack the mystery. Giving you what amounts to a finite pool of actions is a huge restriction and really messes with the usual detective game rhythm, but in giving each action a bit of strategic friction, strategy and planning emerges where there wouldn't be any, and instead of just mindlessly going through collecting all the information, you need to choose what questions to ask and what places are worth investigating, and so it feels way better to assemble all the clues. Another example of friction-based limitations actually creating gameplay can be seen in resource management systems. You might think that by giving players limitless mana or ammo, that they'd have more freedom to employ whatever tactics they wanted. But in actuality, without this layer of friction, an entire axis of interesting strategic choice disappears. In Dungeons & Dragons, choosing when to use your limited once per rest and high rank spells is an interesting choice that creates a sense of strategic continuity between fights. But in Baldur's Gate 3, where you can just long rest between every major scrap, fights lose this element of planning and instead just become about spamming overpowered stuff against even weak enemies. And in Outer Worlds 2, the game lets you stockpile thousands of bullets. And once I realised this, there became very little reason not to use the ammo-chewing minigun, which is supposed to be balanced by its inefficiency, in every fight. Because now, without that limitation as a factor, it was just a universal answer to everything. Each point of friction in a game, each step in a gameplay loop that has some sort of hoop to jump through or a negative externality to deal with, creates a new obstacle to overcome and a new problem to solve. And it's this principle that explains why a whole bunch of high friction games seem to have deeper, richer gameplay than their smoother, lower friction counterparts. The reason why Factorio is the best factory game isn't just because of its superlative balance, it's because of the bugs, which react to pollution and attack your base, and that many similar games omit under the mistaken assumption that they have nothing to do with the main optimization loop. However, Factorio's frictiony foes actually represent an important source of pressure that incentivizes building an efficient factory and forces you to create and reliably supply interesting new production chains in order to maintain your ever-growing defensive line. The fact that your hapless chumps in all kinds of permadeath games can get maimed, go crazy, or straight up die feels pretty awful, but without the potential for these setbacks, these games would lose a whole bunch of depth, because in undergoing these tragedies, the game creates a whole bunch of new choices as you recover, find replacements, and plan to avoid one of your best guys getting shot in the brain and dying instantly next time. And, even on a purely informational level, the best open world games are always the ones that give you the least info on where everything is and make exploring the most difficult. This sounds paradoxical until you realise that by giving you the location of every point of interest and nice easy paths to get there, overly permissive games, cough Ubisoft cough, remove the thrill of discovery and of pushing your way through a harsh world that only comes from persevering through friction. Of course, That's not to say that friction automatically makes a game deeper or more varied. Friction only increases the scope of our experience when it meaningfully intersects with some other systems or mechanics, and many of the most hated elements of various games are really just friction systems that aren't doing their job properly. Escort quests suck because while they're supposed to give you an extra consideration in battle, more often than not, the thing you're escorting is never in that much danger, and so they're usually just a superfluous feeling dead weight that you've got to drag around. And when games force you to run back to your corpse when you die, the intent is to use the threat of friction to make death more meaningful. But because runbacks don't usually invoke any new gameplay decisions or lasting consequences, they feel like adding insult to injury instead. And the worst, most infamous, annoying friction-based mechanic in games is, without a doubt, encumbrance systems. These systems where you move slower for carrying too much stuff suck because that punishment doesn't really push on any other element of the game besides your patience, and we don't like doing the inventory management maths because almost always the stuff we're managing is just vendor trash and there's so much of it that we get bored quickly. But by reorienting this friction to actually matter, suddenly this really annoying mechanic can become incredibly compelling. Storage management is much more fun, for example, in games like the Bazaar or Backpack Heroes, where your battle efficiency is directly tied to the layout of your inventory, drastically increasing the complexity of this mechanic and giving you real consequences for not organising your stuff right. And in games where carry limits are much stricter and much more harshly enforced, like Dragon's Dogma 2, you actually care about what you're lugging around, because the last thing you want when you get ambushed by a griffin is to be weighed down by camping supplies. And even in Arc Raiders, inventory management is interesting because you're always forced to balance loot efficiency with actually getting the damn stuff out and back to your base, with there being a little bonus decision in the form of what to put in your safety up-the-bum pocket that returns with you even if you die, creating an extra organisation consideration. This brings us back to that fundamental conflict between the necessity of friction and the fact that the reason why it works is because we don't want to deal with it. Whether it's a sticking point in a gameplay loop that forces us to make a new decision before we can continue, or a piece of mechanical friction that demands we exert just a little bit more effort and deal with a little bit more risk, the negative stimulus of friction is what allows the bits of games we actually enjoy to exist. And without it, not only will games not really function, but it will be impossible to take pride in our skill expression, or strategic instincts, or our creative agency, or anything else, because without friction to push against, none of our choices would really mean anything. This is why it's so important for us as players, and developers alike, to resist the temptation to remove friction from the equation outright, rather than seeking to overcome it by making it an interesting obstacle. While a totally smooth, frictionless experience sounds nice, often it introduces far more problems than it fixes, as mechanics that originally moved as a single unit stop interacting properly. We see this all the time in survival games. Developers introduce hunger and thirst systems because it's a constant source of pressure, but then realize these systems are annoying, and instead of making them fun by giving them interesting friction with other areas of the game, they just make growing a little farm trivially easy, and then the entire mechanic may as well not exist at all. And then these systems end up feeling even more irritating because now they don't even provide a compelling challenge. Equally, I mentioned Zelda weapon degradation earlier, and consider what would happen if you simply remove that mechanic outright. Suddenly, you'd have almost no reason to fight enemies, because once you've got a good sword, you'll have no need for the replacement weapons they drop, and consequently the arrows and potion ingredients that make fighting easier, because you'll be doing way less of it. This also means you'll have much less use for food, very little use for new armor, or much of anything in the open world besides shrines. Weapon degradation might not be a fun mechanic. Hell, new Zelda combat has a bunch of problems, but without it, a surprising amount of the game completely falls apart, because the need to replace your weapons constantly is what drives you forward towards the next bit of gameplay. And, in a similar vein, the danger of eliminating friction is just as apparent for player behaviour as well. It's totally natural to want to remove or avoid time-consuming or stressful or risky parts of games, but sometimes these elements are load-bearing parts of the experience, and without them, we lose way more than we gain. We constantly feel the need to spoil ourselves on the best, most optimal builds, the locations of secret treasure, and the best ways to progress, not even when we're stuck, but just as a matter of protocol, and in so doing, we rob ourselves of potentially fun discoveries and moments of payoff that are now totally pointless because we've circumvented the friction that made them feel worthwhile. All because when it comes to friction, our brains are kind of a bit broken, and that's both why it works and why it's so dangerous as well. And to get back to the original topic of the video, I think it was this fundamental realization that saved Arc Raiders, and it's why the game underwent such a dramatic under-the-hood transformation. Changing the gameplay loop from just rushing to a boss fight to poking around looking for trash to shove in your pockets gave you a reason to explore the map and gave every fight interesting consequences because your loot is always on the line. Making the Arc robots tougher and your character weaker rewards not Twitch skill, but a deeper mastery of these systems and tactics. And it also makes you appreciate stuff like their cool procedural animations for things like arc robots getting their propellers destroyed. And adding PvP created a constant source of tension and ambiguity that not even the most advanced enemy AI in the world could ever match. Now, simply avoiding a fight can be an exhilarating journey, and teaming up with other players or saving their lives is now an expression of diplomacy and teamwork rather than simply being the default option. By adding friction to their game, Embark gave something that felt insubstantial and inconsistent weight and context, unifying their existing good ideas into a single gameplay system that finally worked as one. Of course, this isn't to say that Embark's approach to making Arc Raiders work was the only one, or that you personally, who has already posted in the comments about how you don't like PvP, have to enjoy it or else, only that the kind of and amount of friction that developers choose to use is very important for changing how they feel to play. Games that lean in on the more immediate mechanical friction of reaction speeds and fast-paced decision-making feel very different to those that emphasize big-picture strategic friction and resource management, as we can see in other extraction games. The very cute Escape from Tarkov leans into much more fast-paced arcadey combat against loads of enemies, and Quasimorph, which is a turn-based dungeon crawler extraction game, is all about tactics and managing the ever-growing threat of demon invasion. Both of these games are exclusively PvE and use different sources of friction to tie their experiences together, ending up with them feeling very different, both to each other and to the likes of Arc Raiders, in which the player versus player element is crucial to the tension and risk management that underpins its relationship to friction. The key isn't that one form of or amount of friction is better than the other, only that games need some form of friction in order to work. Whether we like it or not, and we're not supposed to like it, friction is an inherent part of what makes games work. And while not all friction improves games, nothing else serves its function of connecting disparate parts of an experience together and giving us as players something tangible to affect within it. Whether that friction takes the form of incremental obstacles and low-level problems to solve that force you to pay attention and be engaged with what's going on, or bigger picture, higher level challenges that make games more complex and give you more choices to make, without friction, games would be infinitely shallower and less rewarding. And so while we don't need to masochistically embrace every aspect of bad UI or time-consuming busy work, we do need to understand that sometimes all this inconvenient stuff exists for a reason. So, whenever you next find yourself getting annoyed at what feels like an arbitrary limitation or hurdle in a game, try to think about what attempting to overcome this friction is getting you to do and think about. Because I reckon, more often than not, you'll realise that as frustrating as it may be, actually, you know what? On second thoughts, friction sucks. This game fucking sucks. Back to Hello Kitty Island Adventure. Screw this. Hello, and welcome to this, the After the Video segment. Sorry for the delay, but don't worry, it's because I've been working on 2 videos in parallel, and should have another one out before the end of the year. Plus, we've also got the special end of the year video, so I've been very busy indeed, don't worry. Oh, and also I did get all my wisdom teeth taken out because I was deemed not wise enough to be allowed them, so that did probably also delay things as well. Whatever. Anyway, this is the part of every video where I shout out some cool things that you need to be made aware of, and this time I thought I'd point you in the direction of a season-appropriate thing, and that is the Yogscast Jingle Jam Charity Collection that has just gone up as of when I'm recording this. Every year, these guys put on a big charity drive that raises millions of dollars, and you fund it by buying a bunch of great games. Included in the collection are some titles that I've shouted out in last year's Games You Should Have Played video, like Mouthwashing and Tactical Breach Wizards, as well as some other great titles like Dungeons of Hinterberg, Old World, and Ixion, plus some other stuff that I've not played, but is probably good. It's amazing value, it's for charity, what's not to like? Please give it a look. And on the subject of having some spare cash lying around, another charitable cause you can support, if you're feeling like it, is this channel. The people who give me money every month on Patreon or YouTube memberships are the lifeblood of my career, and are quite possibly the best people on the internet. Every single one of them, and you probably know some of them by now, are a huge part of why this channel is still running. And so if you want me to be forever in your debt and, you know, give you an alibi for a murder, or help you bury the body, or something like that, please do consider throwing a few bucks my way. Of course, it's not just a one-way street. People who support the channel get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes goodies, extra bonus content the general public doesn't get to see, and even their name in the credits. So if you do want to join the list of illustrious cool people I'm about to say, then you know exactly where to go. And those people are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Alna94, Alyes94, Bobby, Brian Notariani, Constantine Amend, Cosmic360, Daniel Medjes, Daniel Ursin, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digletier, Dis Ellie, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Spacebun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fuller Baxi, Furious Hulk, Gazcol, Pow, Heck It's Noah, I Support Trans Rights, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Conlove, Kangi, Luke Kokorin, Macewinder54, Maxim Filipov, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-Like Substance, Mika Oi, Michael C, Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Seslux, Silver Folfy, Tyler Duncan, Timoteus Bexek, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Bradsmeyer, and Chow. Okay, that's it from me, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a few weeks. Bye!